Well, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to be hosting on behalf of the Australian Clinical Trials Alliance and the Australian Teletrial Program this session today, which we've entitled Avoiding Groundhog Day. Now, some of you who are reading the news might be aware that it is actually still Groundhog Day in the US. So it was a coincidence and what we thought would be a sort of a slightly wry way of looking at this. Those of you who've dialed in, and obviously many of you will work in the field of medical research and clinical trials, will, whether you're on the clinical trial side or even on the governance and ethics side, will understand that there's always a system here of where we have to do the applications, we have to do all the processing, and we have to get the approvals in place. Now, most people have complained that the system can be somewhat quiet. Sorry, Joe, just a second. Can be a little bit complicated. So that's the purpose of today is we've gathered a group of individuals to discuss this. Now, without further ado, Joe, if we go to the next slide, I'll just acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on now. We're across the whole of Australia and maybe even some other countries. I don't know who's online, but I'm here in Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So if we go to the next slide. So I just want to note that we have actually, we will be recording this session, will be made available on the website subsequently. There is a Q&A button that you should be able to see. If you want to ask questions, you can do so at any time. We'll be keeping a note and we'll be reading them out. Unfortunately, with the webinar today, there isn't the facility to take live questions from the floor and have people speak to them simply because of the nature of the program. But we will do our best to read them out and respond to them appropriately. The format of today is a brief presentations from each of the guest presenters and then a panel discussion. We do hope as well that you will take the time to fill in a post-webinar feedback survey. It's only 4 questions, very small, but does help us a great deal in planning these kinds of events for the future. Any questions to Joe? And I do want to acknowledge Joe at this stage for an enormous amount of work that Joe has put into this. I get to speak to this, but Joe has done a huge amount of the work in the background. So, and her colleagues in the ACTA and ATP offices also. If we go to the next slide, today we have an excellent panel. Several of the speakers have been at a variety of meetings, and you will probably know some of them, but we have Shyam, who's a consumer advocate and a consumer member with a background in research himself. Sonia Hancock, who comes from Queensland, is chair of the Metro South HREC and has a long history of working in research and research management. Claire, similarly in the NT, and they'll tell you a little bit more about themselves as they go through their presentations. Nadine from WA, and Ali Robertson, who is in WA at the moment, but was in Victoria previous to that. And together they've got a huge amount of knowledge and experience in working in clinical research and clinical research management, and particularly trials. And they were working together with ACTA and ATP to come up with the principles. Now, I'm going to quickly whip through these, and I'm going to do it deliberately fast so that you don't have an opportunity to really go into great detail on them. Some of them will be spoken about by the presenters. But rather than come up with a set of additional guidance material, there is loads of guidance material. There are lots of ways to do things to support clinical trials and to make sure that they're conducted appropriately. But what we thought was, are we getting the principles right? Is the purpose of why we're doing this really as clear as it could be? And so we decided that we would take a principles-based approach. And this is really about collaborations, treating the work that is done by the research offices, ethics, governance, and the trials themselves as a collaboration rather than a them and us. And the supervision plans that the ATP have been working at between the primary sites and the satellite sites really as a demonstration of that collaboration, and that should be developed together as a partnership. And this also means then that we can use contractual agreements which are streamlined. We do the reviews in a timely fashion. If we go to the next slide, that we're very focused on what needs to get done for safety rather than just box ticking and procedural compliances, all of which are necessary to the extent that they are, but not overdoing it or redoing things that have already been done before. And some of that will include really taking a leap into trust. And we will talk a lot about trust today. There are some management things around accepting budgets and fees and accepting the lead HREC. But again, these are things that will come out in the discussion today. And these principles will be out for public release shortly. And of course, like any of these kinds of principles, they are not written in stone. They can be changed. We will take consultation. And of course, they'll be amended to make them work, because at the end of the day, they have to work. I think there are some very pragmatic points made here about reporting, which would have relevance to any kind of trial, not just teletrials. So I hope that will come out through this discussion as well today. So I think if we kick off, I think I'll just remind you that there will be a post-webinar seminar survey. Please fill it in. And to put your questions and answers in the box, we'll be studying it diligently. But without further ado, I am going to go straight to Shyam, who is going to have the great honor of speaking first and setting the scene for us. And he can tell us a little bit more about himself and what this means to him. Shyam.
Can everyone hear me? All right. Yep. Thank you so much, and good morning to you all. Sorry, I'm joining in from India. I'm on a meeting and a conference here, and it's 6:30 a.m. today. So, but this topic is close to my heart, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional landowners in which I live, work, and play in Adelaide, the Ghana people. But as Nick said, today is a Groundhog Day still in US, and when I looked at the meaning, it's really relevant to this topic. But in clinical trial as such, where a groundhog means a situation in which a series of unwelcome or tedious events appears to be occurring in exactly the same way. I think we all hope, and this research governance principle sets the tone for the teletrial program, how we avoid those things reoccurring, not just from a governance phase, but also from a consumer point of view. As a consumer or a patient who involved in a number of clinical trials, the basic principle for us is the trust that's created between the researcher and the patient. I literally signed up for a number of trials just because of the person who explained the trial really well. They not just as a participant, but also how I can contribute myself. And when you come to the research governance principles and the methodologies, it's about cutting the red tapes, as Nick mentioned, in the rural and remote regional setting, but also it's about empowering those people in the community who not just want to be a participant in a clinical trial, but also an equal partners in a clinical trial. How are the things that we do for them, the skill set that they have are mutually beneficial to our researchers as well. Clinical trial in rural and remote regional setting is all about equity and access, but it's more important to have a scientific question that is relevant to that community. Is that the question prioritized by the community, so that we are not doing the same thing that we do in the traditional models of them versus us, but also it's about with the consumers. It comes back to the principle, nothing about us without us. So it's really important and of utmost priority for the researchers to heed to the need of the community. And that's when it becomes so successful, because as Nick mentioned, often researchers go on a tick box method and thinking that will end up in a good results. But we have to humanize those procedures and policies that are in these principles. That's what more important to me as a consumer who can relate to those principles. Is it coming back to this mutual respect? Is it coming back to the trust building exercise? Is it coming back to collaborative partnership with the consumers, not with just with the primary site or the secondary site? It's about that community that the trial is being conducted. How are we going to transfer all these things that are written in this principle into tangible actions by a researcher who can move the needle towards patient-centric trial? That's what really important, because as we all know, there are so many frameworks as principles, guidelines, but what is different is this is all about asking the people and then not only talking the talk, but also walking the walk of doing those principles in actions. We can discuss more in details about how to do it in action, as we have a lot of panelist members who have done it in the past and who are still doing it in those regional areas. I want to hear those stories that are at the forefront of this, of making a change in this area. So this is my initial comments, and I'm really looking forward to these principles that the ATP came up with, which are so relevant, and it has gone into number of consultation, and how we are going to do this business as usual, not just as an add-on approach when we do consumer engagement. Thank you so much, Nate.
You're on mute, Nick. You need to unmute.
Yeah.
And someone had to do it, and so I've fallen foul of the trap. So you can mark your bingo cards. Sian, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction to this topic, and it really sets up for Sonia to tell us about her experiences.
Thank you so much, and it really is a pleasure to follow Shyam's presentation, particularly when we're talking about placing the patient or the participant front and center. So I'll just wait for the slides to pop up. But as I begin, I'd like to pay my respects and acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet, and to the elders past, present and emerging, both within the room here today and online. I come to you from Metro South, which is located in Brisbane, and representing or sitting on the lands of the Yugara and Turrbal people. But most importantly, I'd actually like to acknowledge and reflect on the strength and courage of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. If I can just go back a slide, thank you. I'd like to acknowledge the strength and courage of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have participated in health and medical research, both in the past and certainly, and more importantly, in the future. Through their stories, we have heard just how important retaining cultural identity in connection with the lands and waterways are. It's not only in hearing these stories, we are also hearing stories from other underserved and underrepresented populations. It's at this point that I'd like to take you on a little bit of my professional story. Next slide, please. So how on earth did I get here? It all started by being really at the right place at the right time. Probably a very familiar sort of scenario for those of you who work as a research administration professional, as I could probably quite hand on heart say not too many people aspire to be a regulator, but somehow land there. So way back when in the late 90s, early thousands, I was an oncology hematology nurse. And like many others, I fell into research. Becoming a clinical trial coordinator, I soon became the connector between the participants and the researcher. It's a very unique relationship, this one. The nurse on the floor has so many more patients needing their time, whereas in a clinical trial, the relationship moves further away from being task-oriented and more person-centered. Through increased contact time from completing study procedures, adverse event reporting, you find yourself knowing a great deal about patients. It was really through this lens that I soon grasped the inordinate amount of strength and resilience of our research participants and the significant adjustments that they had to make to participate or to be a part of a clinical trial. Max, he was one such patient who travelled 3 hours per day. Now, this is probably most of our daily commutes, but to a patient who is suffering from, a cancer, and he was in stage 4, his quality of life really mattered here. At the time, it was something that just had to be done, but now I can't help think that this is ludicrous, given that there was a hospital actually near where he lived that could have very well given him the treatment that we did, if they just had the right setup. Max will always remain my reason why, the reason what I do, why I do it, and who I fight the good fight for. So some years after Max passed, my career took a turn away from the clinical environment to more research regulation. In 2014, I was successful in obtaining the role of the Research Governance Manager in a very large health service. There was no training for this role. I literally landed, put my feet under the desk and just went, where do I start? For me, it was very much learning on the job. Steep learning curve, no doubt, to get my head around all the rules and regulations and Contract 101, not just about clinical trials, but all sorts of types of research endeavours. And it literally took trial and error and lots of questions, and I mean lots of questions, while all the while I kept Max in my mind and all that he went through just so that he could access new treatments from a metropolitan hospital. So fast forward another decade, and now as the chair of one of Queensland's largest HRECs, Max is still very much front and centre. He may have passed, but his story of strength, courage and resilience rings louder than ever in my ears, particularly when now we are in a strengthened position of collaboration, working in a networked environment and a collective shift to a unified model of clinical trial service delivery through the Australian Teletrials program. Next slide, please. So now that you understand my reason why, let me take you through some of the how-to. We live in a society surrounded by rules and regulations. There's no escaping it for sure. Whilst the rules and regulations are our hard stops, for good reason I might add, guidance documents exist that provide a real-world interpretation of the rigidity of legislation. Guidance documents that bring the regulations to life and enable practical advice on how to deliver. For those who operate within the sector, I need not elaborate on all the different SOPs, clinical trial handbooks, ICH, GCP, etc., etc. Given that I'm on this panel representing a HREC's perspective, I will refer to our core guiding document, the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, and its very, very close cousin, the Australian Code for the Responsible Conduct of Research, also known as the Code. Fundamentally, the HREC's role is to consider the ethical implications of research. The principles we're talking about here are research, merit and integrity, respect, beneficence and justice. First and foremost, the research participant, front and centre, always. Everything else wraps itself around protecting the participants and enabling them the right to choose, the right to receive healthcare in their local community, and the right to have access to the latest healthcare advancements through clinical trials from their local community. Enabling access of clinical trials to participants who live in rural, regional and remote areas demonstrates a commitment to research merit in that the study is being conducted by adequately supervised staff in facilities and resources that are appropriate. Teletrials enable fair access to the benefits of research, a key ingredient of the justice principle. By enabling access to clinical trials into rural, regional and remote areas, the ethical principle of beneficence is enabled through due considerations of the participants' welfare, in that they don't have to travel and spend an inordinate amount of time travelling to a major metropolitan health service when they can quite easily and readily receive the care in their local community. And of course, one could argue the most important principle is the principle of respect being upheld through recognition of the intrinsic value that participants bring when committing their contribution to the advancements of healthcare for all, and the intrinsic trust that the Australian and the international communities expect research to be conducted responsibly, ethically, and with integrity. Next slide, please. So now that I've taken you through some of the theory, here is my real-world take on it. As a HREC, there is an obligation to ensure that a clinical trial is both ethical and scientifically sound. that the potential benefits of participation outweigh the risks, and that the design of the trial doesn't exclude. From a HATREC perspective, enabling access of clinical trials to regional and remote communities is in fact an ethical strength in providing opportunities for the underserved and underrepresented. I'm going to be a little bit on the controversial side here and suggest that it could be argued that it is in fact unethical to inhibit access to clinical trials for those in the remote and regional regions. That the reason why a clinical trial can't be delivered in those areas due to red tape or bureaucracy is, in my opinion, a little unethical. There should be fair distribution and access of the benefits of participation in research. Now, for those who like to know exactly what the HATREC needs, a simple amendment, but actually I'd like to move that away to a simple notification. A HATREC is not going to stand in the way of delivery of clinical trial or healthcare to those who need it the most. Adding a satellite site is the same or very similar to adding a site. We, as in the HATREC, just need to know that the site has the appropriate expertise, training and qualifications in order to conduct a clinical trial following the GCP regulations and other relevant SOPs. And if any different recruitment methodologies apply to any of the participating sites. So hopefully I've provided some clarity that once you have let your approving HATREC know about the inclusion of a satellite site, that you have the green light and then some to commence or even convert some of your existing clinical trials into teletrials. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. And that really sort of evokes that idea, you know, your personal journey of wanting to make sure that there is access to building the knowledge and participating. And I think that's something, it's such an altruistic gesture, participation in a clinical trial. There may be no personal benefit, but it may well help others. And we'll return to that as we come to the panel. Claire, you're next, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, Nick, and thank you, Joe, for inviting me to join today. I'd also just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of land that we are meeting on, and noting that I'm joining from Darwin, the Larrakia people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So a bit of context. I'm a nurse by trade, similar to Sonia. I've sort of gone through research coordination and then into research governance. And then now my current role is the director of the Clinical Innovation and Research Unit, which is an NT-wide service. So we host the Research Governance Office, the Australian Teletrial Program, and implementation of national initiatives like the One Stop Shop, National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. So I just thought I'd share my perspective and our experience with research governance and setting up teletrials in the NT. We only established a research governance office about 6 years ago. So we were always evolving and growing as a unit. And just for a bit of context, the NT, the Northern Territory is made up of 5 regions. So we have 5 major hospitals across the regions, and NT Health is a single entity. So we have one research governance office, which is based in Darwin, and the team receive applications from across the Northern Territory for all of the hospitals. And we also work closely with the NT Department of Health and Menzies School of Health Research. They're based on campus at the hospital, Royal Darwin Hospital as well. And they're certified NMA Ethics Committee as well. Thanks, Joe. Just the next slide. Thanks, Joe. So I really like this roadmap. I think it's developed by Alfred Trial Hub initially and ATP. Is that right, Nick? And so it gives a good overview of, I guess, the complexity of setting up a clinical trial in general, multi-site or single site. But I like that you've got the highlighted light blue. So there's 4 additional sort of operational components to setting up a teletrial. So in the NT, we've set up 8 teletrial clusters since the beginning of the program. and 5 of those are cross-jurisdictional. The first one was between NT and SA I think we got it started in 2023. And I believe that was the first cross-jurisdictional trial set up within the program for the teletrial program. That took nearly 12 months to get up and running, which was a little bit disheartening. We did end up getting a patient on the trial, but we've sort of, we kind of questioned, oh, why don't we just do a multi-site? Like, what's the benefit of the teletrial model? But we've persevered with the model. We've set up another 4 cross-jurisdictional trials now since then, and each time the approval process has become smoother and approval time has gotten quicker, which I think there's confidence growing in the sector across Australia in the model, that the model works, and this has been really beneficial for the Northern Territory. As I mentioned, we've only we've got a lot of land, not a huge number of people. Everyone is spread out. And so being able to leverage from the larger hospitals across Australia is really beneficial. And we have got a lot of patients, even from MM7 regions in Central Australia, on clinical trials that we wouldn't have been able to without the model. Just next slide, please, Joe. So this is just a quick snapshot. So to set up a teletrial, there is only, as I mentioned before, sort of an additional 4 components. So we have the supervision plan, which is a really important governance document, which gives assurance to your research governance officers that there's good oversight, and there's been a lot of communication between the primary PI to have good oversight over the satellite sites. So that's an important RGO document. Sometimes I think there's been confusion about whether that's an ethics or RGO. So that should sit with your research governance team to review. It can be noted by your ethics committee. So we've also got standard subcontracts now to bind the primary site with the satellite sites. And there's also the standalone teletrial participant information sheet consent form or additional wording, and that's for the actual teletrial program. And then there's also encouraged teletrial specific wording in your initial protocol development. So those resources are available. I think they're on the ACTA website, and there's a lot of resources available on the ATP website as well. Joe, do you mind just next slide, please? Thank you. So I just thought I'd just sort of put some questions out there for everyone to sort of consider while we're talking today, and a bit of learning from the NT. What I found has worked well and been beneficial for us is the RCCC early engagement with our both research governance and ethics committee, and that ongoing education around processes as they evolve, new forms, things to look at. And also our research governance office, as I mentioned, are quite new and developing. We've constantly, the RGO team are evolving. So things like our submission SSA form has been updated to allow for teletrial reporting. And it's also, so it's at the front of people's mind when they're submitting an SSA, is this a teletrial? And then, kind of considering, well, if it isn't, why not? Good communication during the feasibility stage of setting up your teletrial is really important. With both, your HREC, RGO and the sites, between the sites, and strong collaboration with your site PI. And I've also found sponsors willing to be sort of flexible with their approach as well. If, sometimes there's certain aspects of the trial that we haven't been able to do. Sponsors have been, their willingness to be a bit more innovative in their approach has been really beneficial. And I think considering the principles approach where you've got that cluster approvals, that mutual acceptance, that has been sort of easy, and it just occurs here in the NT because we have that single research governance office. So additional sites are added as an amendment, as opposed to a site-specific full SSA form going through multiple research governance offices within the same jurisdiction. But yeah, keen to chat today about how others might think that might work. I think that the engagement with the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework and the one-stop shop is going to be really beneficial. So a lot of, if you can, if you're part of the engagement team with the NOS, I think that's really important that we get this, if we do go ahead with this cluster mutual acceptance sort of approach, that needs to be embedded in these new platforms that we're developing. I've just got one more slide, Joe. I just wanted just for those that are interested, a quick snapshot of the clusters that we have set up. So the majority of ours have been cross-jurisdictional with South Australia. We've recently set one up with Victoria and Queensland, and then we've got the internal, clusters within the Northern Territory. Yeah, thank you. Happy to chat more.
And I think what's important, again, it sort of builds on the other presentations and Shyam's view about trust. What we're building here is relationships. And as we build confidence in those relationships and as we get to know one another, we get to know a little bit about each other and what motivates us, and realizing that we've got that common goal. So, that's the theme that's emerging. Go to Nadine, and then Ali will have the roundup, and then we'll go to the panel.
Thanks, Nick. I'm joining you from the beautiful Whadjuk country of the Noongar people here in Perth today. My background is as a clinical trial coordinator, and most of my work has been in liver disease. So I've spent a lot of years working with underserved populations, mainly injecting drug users and people who are new to Australia, including refugees. And now I've moved to the WA Country Health Service, where we're working on improving equity of access for people who live in country areas. So some of my slides will be a little bit more focused on country, but I do believe these principles could apply equally as well to other underserved populations. And as Sonia and Nick spoke about, we have many principles around research governance for Australia and also locally. But my question is, do our existing principles that we have cover all the aspects that we need for satellite site authorisation, or do we need more principles? And I feel the answer may lie in understanding the complexity of the satellite site model and some of the pain points that have arisen as we've gone through the process of implementing teletrials, which is all about the satellite site model. And this is, I think, particularly important where we have separate legal entities. That's where it can become a little bit more difficult. Sorry, Joe, I'm a little bit slow with keeping up. So traditionally, we'd have our trial site, we'd have one submission to a research governance office, and they would raise their queries and resolve them or provide authorisation. Then when we introduce a satellite site across a different institution, we end up with a second submission to another research governance office. And that research governance office will also have their own questions and queries and requests for how we might, what we might need to do for the trial. Sorry, Joe, it's just a couple of clicks. Thank you for taking this on, given I had a little bit of trouble sharing my own slides. I appreciate it. And the primary site may also have additional questions about this other institution that they're now working with and taking some responsibility for as well. When we have multiple satellite sites, we have multiple submissions and multiple reviews, and we have a duplication of our work. And we often receive conflicting requests and conflicting requirements. And if you can do a couple more clicks, please, Joe, we'll see those other satellite sites as well. And then these requests may also circle back and forth to ethics and we may feel that we are going around and around in a Groundhog Day type cycle rather than moving forward. And this all costs time and costs money. And ultimately, I feel it disincentivizes the satellite site model, and that disincentivizes equity of access. On a more positive note, I will touch on what I feel has worked well for us in WA Health. So we've put together a research ethics and governance working group, particularly for teletrials, and we've had representation from each of our WA Health service providers, and we have several different institutions in WA running clinical trials. We really focused on building trust between the institutions, and we worked together to develop principles that everyone could feel ownership over and have a consensus around. And we also co-designed state-specific procedures, which are very detailed and very much related to WA, our platform and how we work. But it's something that I guess is relatively easy to grasp for the people who receive our applications, which are often a more junior RGO receiving our request to add a satellite site. So this has helped us to streamline our submission, review and authorisation process for satellite sites. And thinking more nationally and what we could do to help facilitate satellite site review, I have been thinking about principles that could apply so that we can create an environment that is conducive to non-traditional sites, to satellite sites, so that people can access trials where they need to be able to access them and avoid the time and cost penalty that can be associated with putting these things in place. I have pinched some of these from our WA group and the principles that they felt were important, and also from the principles that Nick shared earlier, and some of the issues that are being raised nationally, the things that are being discussed nationally. These are just ideas on a page that came to mind, and wondering whether nationally, if some really high level principles would be helpful, and perhaps some examples. Principles like co-review, where we have a collaborative and communicative review with agreed queries across the RGOs, or focused review, where each party knows what their responsibility is to review. I'm a big fan of parallel submissions, so that we remove sequential gatekeeping so that we can progress through faster. Non-duplication of reviews, so can we have generalisation of protocols and PICFs that work across all the sites, reducing the number of amendments that we're putting through. Can we be cost neutral so that we don't have additional fees when we want to add a satellite site, and consult with HREC and the TGA so that we can have streamlined complementary processes as well. And while thinking about this, I'm really keen to hear, as we talk to everyone today, about who the audience for these principles would be, and how we could create principles that really resonate with the end users, and develop principles that are really helpful and won't be a hindrance at the local level, and that consider the multiple different scenarios we may be in when these principles are being applied. My vision for the future is a satellite site ready future, where we have all of the CTRAs and the CIRA ready for adding satellite sites, a simple CTN notification scheme where there's not a lot of additional administrative work and costs for satellite sites, one-stop structure. There's too many S's in that one for satellite sites, and also to develop enough familiarity with the process so that our researchers are able to provide clear and concise submissions around what they need to add sites, and efficient co-review between institutional RGOs. And ultimately, the dream is to be able to provide country patients with equitable access to clinical trial therapies.
Thank you. And that sort of continues our theme as well about building this equity of access, because ultimately that's what we want from these principles and from the frameworks that we create. We'll go to Ali, and then we'll do a quick wrap up, and then we've got one question already, but please, if you can start writing your questions, if you have any for the panelists, I'll direct them there. But let's hear from Ali, and then we'll come to the questions.
Thanks, Nick. Like Nadine, I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm on Whadjuk Whadjuk, and I pay my respects to the Noongar people who are and always will be the custodians of the beautiful lands of southwest WA. So we heard from Cheyenne that the community wants co-design and equitable access for trials. Therefore, we, the health sector, have an obligation to enable that in a safe and effective manner. And it's fantastic that ATP have created the framework and the principles, but it's our responsibility to implement this. So just in my 5 minutes, I want to tell you a bit about my experience, why the principles are important, and what I've learned over my 20 years in research governance and research operations. So my experience is in pediatrics across 2 different states. And equitable access looks a bit different in pediatrics. So I want to talk to you about a couple of situations that we've faced in the past. One is around adolescents and young adults. So they have poorer outcomes than their younger and older counterparts. And one of the main reasons for that is that they don't have equitable access to trials. And this is not necessarily because they're living rurally and regionally. This is because they're a 21-year-old with a pediatric disease being treated in an adult hospital, or they're a 21-year-old with a pediatric disease, or they're a 15-year-old with an adult cancer being treated in a pediatric hospital. So, looking at what equitable access, was for them, we really had to, undertake a piece of work, understand what the consumers wanted. And yes, they wanted both, the trial to be brought to them, but they also wanted to be able to go to the trial when possible. So, it's important to listen to our consumers around co-design. It's important to consider the principles, and using the teletrial model, is one way of doing that. So in that situation, we created built a relationship between the Peter MacCallum Cancer Centre and the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne, which are only 200 metres apart. But without that relationship, we had people not being able to access, trials at one or the other. So using those principles, using that teletrial model, we were able to take paediatric trials to Peter Mac, and we were able to bring young adults from Peter Mac to access a trial at the RCH. My next example is in Western Australia. So the Perth Children's Hospital, the Child and Adolescent Health Service, whom I'm employed by, is the statewide paediatric service. If you get cancer in WA, you come down to Perth to get treated. So we have a long way to go in terms of accessing standard care in the community, let alone trials. But one of the issues we do have is we're still a relatively small population, state population. And so our patients miss out on trials that don't come to WA. So we need to think about, what does that look like in terms of equitable access? Is that an expectation that families have to travel interstate? How can we get trials open here? So we're looking at a model, again, we've built a relationship, we've established connections with the paediatric hospitals around Australia, and we're looking at a model that we're calling Skyhook, where we can be poised to open a trial if we get a patient. Because, the other issue is, if we just have all of the trials potentially open, we might never get patients. The burden on the health system, is difficult. So looking at, can we create a model where a trial is approved and ready to go in Melbourne, a patient is diagnosed in Perth, and we can automatically open a trial here. So, in both of those 2 examples, we used principles that the ATP, have now created. We're putting the patient at the centre of our decision making, and we're making decisions with them when we design these models. As Nick said, you took the words right out of my mouth, building trust is building relationships. So we're collaborating and co-designing, not just with the patients, but also with the other people who are going to be part of the network that we're looking to create. We're focusing on the why, and we're ensuring the process that we develop meets the requirements, not the other way around. I think that we are in a situation where we sort of have one governance process, and we try and fit all of our square pegs into that round hole. But it's important to remember why we're making the decisions that we make. And, if every box is not ticked correctly, however, you have all of the information that you need and everything meets the necessary legislation and requirements, things should be able to, be approved to proceed. So, you know, how do we handle these situations in a timely, effective, and focused way? And it's fantastic that we're standardizing things. And for a standard teletrial, rural, regional to metro, you know, that should be able to happen seamlessly, easily, quickly. But for the other 20%, you know, we can standardize 80% for the other 20%. How do we then learn from those standard processes, take those bits, and then focus on the unique parts of the situation and how we handle them? So Nick asked me to think about what have I learnt over the 20 years that enables me to make these decisions or progress these issues. And I've sort of come up with 3 things. I think the important part of the decision is not the decision that you make, but it's the deliberation process, who you consult with, the information that you glean, and how you come up with your decision. Sonia, as the chair of an ethics committee, will know, or those of us who worked before National Mutual Acceptance will know, that different decisions can be made and they're still right. You know, it's not about the ultimate decision, but it's about how you come to the decision. The next one is that accountability equals responsibility. So understanding in your role, what are you accountable for? Are you accountable for making the ultimate decision? Are you accountable for making a recommendation to a director or an executive director to make that decision? And, you know, really working within the scope of your accountability and responsibility. You know, if it's your decision to make, get the information, build the collaborations, the networks, and then make that decision. Don't be afraid to make that decision. And then the third one is making those networks, leaning on people who've done it before and learning from them.
Thanks, Sally. So now we've got a few questions in the chat already, which I'm not sure. Can you all see the questions? Have you you can see those, so that's good. I think there's a couple of themes that come from them. So thank you to those who've put those questions in the box. So Ash has started with the idea of do we even need a teletrial? You know, what is the whole thing about a teletrial that makes it different to any other kind of trial? And we've heard a number of you talk about the fact that actually we're talking about clinical services, about making sure that there's the capability and that it's nuanced to the appropriate area and needs of that community. So I think one of the things that when we did a consultation, Joe and I had been working with all of you across the trials networks, talking with patient groups, talking with people who design trials, was that it's about designing the trial to be as inclusive as possible for the maximum number of people, recognizing that you might not achieve perfection, but you're going to try as much as is possible. And so the idea that there was a teletrial versus a regular trial wasn't true. That in fact, teletrials was a methodology, and that all trials should apply or consider a variety of methodologies. And two of the other questions have asked, well, how, to some extent then, do you know that you're using the right methodologies or you're being as inclusive as possible when you do the trial design? How do we achieve that? Unless you consult every single group. So I might throw that one at Chaim a little bit to start with, and then we can roll it out, whoever wants to put their hand up to it.
So having an inclusive trial group, we always say like consumer engagement model or not just one size fits all. And even my role as a prison health service where I work in prisons, and we are part of a teletrial program. And the first thing I did is, how do you include people from custody in designing of this trial? So I started asking them what is suitable for them in this trial, because being in a unique environment, it gives me an opportunity to do a trial that suits their needs. And as Sonia mentioned, people who are often underserved and under-researched population, and also often under-reached as well. We look at the lens of what is simple to them to be in a clinical trial, and what are the ways that they can be engaged, not just a participant, on a part of a consumer advisory group. So because these are in rural regions, the prisons are, I went and spoke to them, and then they said, there are some things in this clinical trial. For example, they helped with recruitment in terms of designing a simple flyer that advertised within the prison setting. What are the language that should be used that still fulfills this bureaucracy and red tapes, but also still calling out the audiences in prison as well. So the one thing I always practiced and preached is asking the group what they want and learning those things and embedding it as soon as possible so that they can see the change, and not just taking a lengthy time to embed that process, because we often, and that's where HRECs are really important. And that's why I hope to see in this model where when we design a PIC form at locally, there is this mutual agreement between the patients and not the secondary side, but also the primary side, so that the approval is given so fast. And it's not delaying that the people are frustrated already because to enroll in a clinical trial, but once their comments are on board, how we are going to implement them as well, so that they can see the results, and that builds the trust, isn't it? Because trust is not just words, it's in action. How do you build those things? Is showing them in action. And I think this model is well suited to take that feedback from grassroots level and taking into the setting and also approving it as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And Sonia, you'd like to respond too?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to kind of bring this back down to the fact that lo and behold, we have the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework, which is a significant lever and a significant catalyst in actually making research, also, including clinical trials, as part of our core health service delivery. I think where we need to look back at is how do we engage our patients, our consumers of health service, and implement similar consumer partnering models, because I know, for example, Metro South here is developing a quite strategic and strong consumer partnering model, that there shouldn't be anything different for research. It should be part and parcel, because at the end of it, this is a health delivery option for a lot of the patients. And I think until we start changing the language to be inclusive of a clinical trials being a health service line, just like gastroenterology or just like respiratory, I think we will always find a barrier if we don't move away from the different and move more strategically to the all-inclusive.
So Sonia, building on that, and perhaps to others who've had this experience, particularly in the governance offices, I suppose the question has been making research other and immediately assuming a risk to it, rather than simply saying it's, as Sonia has said and Shyam is sort of saying, as building this into the capacity of the organization to do some inquiry, to do clinical trials is a methodology of research. It is a means to test hypotheses. It doesn't necessarily equate to increased risk. It doesn't necessarily use huge amounts of additional resources, but it is treated a little bit scarily. It's like, and we've seen one of the comments here is that, the question about, well, we need the governance approval, but why couldn't that governance approval be no different to the standard pathology agreements and various other things that are integrated in routine care? A bit like the skyhooks concept of the principles of embedding. Why aren't we there yet? I suppose the question would be, has ATP and endeavours like it brought us closer? Is there cause for optimism?
Yeah, I think so, Nick. Oh, sorry, just jumping in without putting my hand up.
Well, Claire, then I'll come to Nadine.
Sorry. Yeah, I think, the teletrial program is working alongside the national initiatives like the National One-Stop Shop, the National Clinical Trials Governance Framework. Me personally, I've seen our institution is it's grown substantially, and the profile of research has grown significantly since the adoption of the model. And we recently underwent accreditation for the clinical trials governance framework, and I can really see, it's improving the culture, and it really is just embedding that concept that it's just part of routine care. And I guess from my perspective, I used to be a research coordinator, participants, I've always seen them to be receiving better care when they're on a trial. It's actually safer because we're following a strict protocol. They're getting follow-up. And we, our clinicians here are providing care which is evidence-based. I think we're getting there.
Excellent. Nadine?
Yeah, just on the why aren't we there yet, I think it's probably because change takes time. And when we're bringing more and more people along the journey with us, particularly in hospitals where they haven't had experience with clinical trials before, we do sometimes need to slow down, take it step by step so that everyone does feel comfortable and that things are rolled out successfully. And I think that, that sort of change can take years and does take years. And to see where we've come from our very first submission for our teletrial and the time it took to go through that process was huge. I mean, we were looking at 12 months to get a satellite site set up, and now it's much, much faster. I think our last one was maybe 2 months. So in my mind, that's a huge shift. But obviously we don't want to stop there. We want to continue to improve it so that it functions just as well as our ordinary addition of a site functions, if not faster.
So Nadine, some of the questions there, Sarah Furlong had asked about RGO main sites have additional considerations, such as in a private clinic that doesn't have its own RGO. And I think you've also touched on in your presentations about some of the satellite sites not necessarily having all of the resourcing of the primary site. But there is that, as you say, building of capacity, which is taking time. And so there is going to be this transition toward confidence and that trust, as Shayan was saying, that trust then that perhaps the primary site can even do some of the governance for the satellite site and trust its approval. Because I think that's the big jump, is can we have another organisation say that this is safe, this is okay, this is, particularly if there's been the consumer involvement. Ali?
I think we are getting there. I think we're moving the dial. As Nadine said, we are faster now than we were a few years ago. I think that what we are realizing, and we're still listening to the community, is that this model is not necessarily fit for every situation, and using the teletrial model is just one tool in our tool belt, if you like. So Ash makes a point about why a teletrial when maybe the other site is just doing standard care activities like imaging and blood work. And I think we have to realize that in those situations, perhaps the teletrial model is not the best model. Perhaps a shared services agreement in those situations, is fine. So, I think having that flexibility and understanding that there are many different ways to get the patient, treated for at least parts of the project closer to home. And that might not be treated, that might not be the drug, but that might be followed up. And in those situations, a shared services agreement, if you already have those connections with those hospitals, those relationships, may be a simpler, faster way.
And I think for that routine care concept, Sarah Hubbard's also added about gaining access to treatments. Can I just go back one step? I know when teletrials are set up, and I know a lot of the conversation goes around brand new drug, access to this new treatment. But a lot of trials can be done pragmatically, where there are differences in care, where we're trying to look at different ways of delivering care more effectively, efficiently, or testing to see whether they're as safe as one another. The pragmatic design trials where there is clinical equipoise between two or more standards of care. And I suppose I'd sort of want to shift a little bit as well to say, can we build a national framework that does evaluation of standard of care to just constantly strive and improve. And I just love your thoughts about that as we build this framework. Shyam?
Nick, that's exactly right. It's all about the quality improvement as well, isn't it? Because as we move from standard of care, and how do you evaluate? Uh, because people often, like even underserved population, have a mistrust about clinical trial, especially CALD communities, because often the trials are uh, often the country where they are coming from, the healthcare itself is paternalistic. So to shift that narrative around clinical trial to improve the standard of care, you have to do a lot of quality improvement project, and that's where the safety and quality team comes in. How do we deliver a standard of care that's relevant to that population, and how do we involve them in delivering that standard of care that is done at a local site or in a healthcare region? And that flips the narrative around mistrust, because people lose retention rates, recruitment rates because of mistrust, not just they fail a protocol. And to build that trust, you need to, as you said, you have to shift in the standard of care that is delivered and how they are included in the governance model in a hospital setting, healthcare setting, because we often have this siloed approach where people think as a clinical trialist, it's important to them. For someone who had a kidney transplant, I went through a journey of diagnosis and then being in hemodialysis for 2 years and then waiting for my transplant. And once I had my transplant, so for me, clinical trial is just one part of my aspect of care. It's not the whole care for my lifetime journey. So it's about accessing my nephrologist, accessing my GP, accessing my nurse practitioners, accessing my pharmacist. So people have to think about the whole life journey of a patient, not just one part of a clinical trial. Yeah.
Thank you, Shyam. And I think that builds this concept as well about the equitable access to trials. We often hear about the wonder drug, oh, I've got access to that, potential drug, but I remind my colleagues in a standard frequentis model, only 50% of the patients are getting the potential new treatment, and it might not be any better. But a couple of our questions have sort of talked about how do you do the design, the co-design, and that's much more amenable, where we're talking about interventions that might be survivorship. They might be, how do you manage chronic care? How do you move away from having to go to a tertiary centre and have that care delivered in the primary care or in the community setting? So I suppose that's the evolution, and it's quite deliberate. We've had input here because it is an Australian teletrial program, is together with its colleagues from Revitalise, Alfred Trial Hub, and the R3, is about equitable access in the regions and to underserved communities. Are we at that point now where we can start to expand our thinking about the trials beyond just the, drug conventional trials sponsored by a commercial company?
I think just being involved in teletrials has already expanded my thinking on what sort of trials we can be involved in, having come from a background of largely just medicine-based clinical trials. I do feel that is sort of happening already, and I agree with you, and I think there really is value in trials in the real world setting as well, and how effective the treatment is when we're using the general patients who are needing the drug and not the perfect patients.
That sort of goes to Hannah's question about the consumer engagement. What is the possibilities of doing that? From an ethics perspective, Sonia, I'm going to throw you a curveball. There's been a question around the traditional model. You mentioned the national statement. The national statement defines who sits on an ethics committee, but really sort of doesn't really talk, I think, sufficiently perhaps about consumer engagement. If a trial has a comprehensive strategy to ensure that the community, what influence does that have on the ethics committee? How important is that over and above the views of the ethics committee members?
I think, you know, fundamentally, the ethics committee is here to serve the participants first and foremost. Moving away from a tokenistic tick and flick, you know, yes, we have consulted with consumers, you know, in the preparation of the PICF. It's more, the depth is far more valuable than the words themselves. You know, one of the things that while Cheyenne was talking and you were talking was that, you know, one of the things that we'd love to see is the fact that there is an inbuilt quality improvement cycle in the actual running of a clinical trial, in that during the whole process, patients or participants are actually engaged in a quality improvement type activity. They provide their feedback. They identify what worked, what didn't work. And that continuous PDCA, you know, plan, do, check, act cycle is very self-evident. You know, it's essentially, it's a learning healthcare system. And having that mechanism for them to actually, the participants, you know, that saying, nothing about us without us, is so true, in that the whole reason why we do what we do is for our grandmother, our grandfather, father, mother, son, daughter, our future generations. And without seeking their input in terms of what works, what didn't work, and then you're modifying, you know, your future designs based on that, it very much is a missed opportunity. And I do see that particularly our investigators who initiate their own trials, so those not necessarily commercially sponsored, have an absolute powerful mechanism to actually advocate for their participants in actually bringing them to the table and being part of the research team, if you like, for future studies based on what they know, their lived experience.
I love that idea of the constant flow of feedback during the trial itself to understand how it's operating. Cheyenne.
I think this is one of the key fraught issues about consumer engagement, especially when we do not the investigator-initiated trials. As Sonia mentioned, it's a lot of trailblazers in that area who can do it really well. But it comes to when trials that are sponsored by huge pharma companies, and but I see that as an opportunity, especially Australia being the preferred site of many global companies, and that's where the PIs and CIs have a responsibility to sell, not just sell, to advocate for the CALD community and the richness of Australian culture. We have people from more than 90 countries in this world. 1 in 2 people have parents who are born overseas. 1 in 4 people are born overseas. So there is a rich, diverse culture in Australia. Rather than touting Australia and selling as a land to do clinical trials so that it's easy to get approval, but to sell it as a diverse nation where they have an opportunity to do embed trials that have diverse population to test not just a homogeneous model, a heterogeneous model where a drug is suitable for all the communities, not just your traditional community of people. So the CIs and PIs, when they design a trial, they should sell it in a way where Australian diversity is valued, not just an access is valued. So yeah.
That's great. Sonia, then we've got 5 minutes left to go. So I'm just going to ask each of you to do think about a sort of 15-20 second wrap-up comment and the take-home message you'd like the people who've attended this to go away with. There will be further opportunities for these kinds of seminars, and please do let us know if you find them useful and if you have any ideas for them. Sonia, and then even if you want to fold your punchline into what you say.
No, perfect. Actually, this is very much a punchline. I came across this yesterday through LinkedIn, and it just rang so true. And I'm going to read it because I want to capture the sentiment quite clearly. Without a diverse participant pool, clinical trials risk perpetuating a cycle of exclusion, leaving certain populations vulnerable to untested, less effective treatments.
Excellent. That builds very nicely. Perhaps Claire, and then I'll go around the table.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I think For me, like we're in a stage of it's massive evolution for clinical trials nationally in Australia right now. You know, this is a perfect opportunity for us. You know, if we can implement clinical trials accreditation, this national one-stop shop, then absolutely we can implement these principles and do it well. I think now's the time.
Fantastic. Ali?
Yeah, I think as Sonia said, remembering that, you know, the ethics committee and the research department are really here to serve and support the community and the clinicians who are supporting the community. And if we can keep thinking about the patient at the center, why we're doing things, having that flexibility and, you know, being pragmatic whilst building those collaborations, then we should be able to get there.
Thank you. Nadine?
In terms of developing the principles, I think it's important to, I guess, well, I value engagement with the end user to make sure those principles really resonate.
Fantastic. And Shyam, I'll give you the last word.
Thanks, Nick. I think to close it off, like to avoid a Groundhog Day, we have to rethink what we are currently doing. And this is a perfect opportunity. And everyone who is involved in clinical trial, no matter what your role is, has a role to play in moving the consumer engagement. Whether we are picking up your phone call to call a patient, or whether you're designing a huge $2 million study, everyone has an opportunity to learn from each other, and that includes learning from your patients as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I just want to thank you all for your participation and your generosity of your time and your input. I've learned a huge amount from a community of people that are, this is a snapshot of, and I learned something every day. I actually took away a number of things from today that I'm going to be thinking about a great deal, particularly in the design of any research that I'm doing, and also when I'm on the other side of the fence from time to time. Please, if you wouldn't mind, the post-webinar feedback survey, it's only 4 questions long. Please fill that in. Write to us if you've got any ideas for topics. But I do want to thank our colleagues and friends at the Australian Teletrial Program, with whom ACTA has worked very closely. We have an excellent partnership, and I'm just delighted at the possibilities that Australia has, and I'm excited about the future. So thank you to all of you, and we hope to see you again soon.